Our journey begins in primordial chaos, simply known as the Void. The Void was populated by a group of formless creatures, more terrifying than anything a human could imagine. These creatures eventually became known as the Elder Gods. No one knows the origins of the Elder Gods, how many there are, or what their purpose is. Their number keeps changing as the Elder Gods would split or join, seemingly at will. One of these fateful occurrences of the elder gods separating resulted in a new kind of god, the kind that did not care for the ways that came before, the kind that could make life rather than just destroy it. This separation resulted in Arius. At first, Arius was shunned by the elder gods as they did not know what to do with this new being. But after this occurred a few more times, the elder gods could no longer stand idly by. By the time the 12th new god was separated, there was all-out war between the elder gods and the new gods. Each of the new gods had a unique trait, and using their various skills, they were able to overpower the elder gods and banish them to the outer fringes of the void. When the war ended, Arius produced the idea to forge a collection of worlds and have creatures that would worship them, the Ækleosphere. The Ækleosphere was also intended to show off the different traits of the gods who had built the Ækleosphere. Kotar was the first to work on the Ækleosphere. Being god of the forge, he was responsible to forge the bases of the different planes. His wife, Arda, stood by him and quenched his creations to bring out their beauty and strength. Kotar laid out the bronze pieces in place and ensured the mechanism would work as the gods had decided. Arius then gifted the mechanism the life crystal that gave the mechanism the power to allow it to function without constant input from the gods. This crystal, being derived from Arius himself, grew slowly over time, increasing the power it released. To help regulate this power, Kotar constructed the City of Glass. This extraplanar city housed both the crystal and the mechanical creatures who maintained the clockwork mechanism of the Ækleosphere and protected it from strange beings drifting in the void. Kotar also forged these creatures, and they became the first beings to inhabit the Ækleosphere. When the foundation of the world was forged and the world was done, the other gods began to ply their traits to make the 9 planes of existence able to support life. Melina, wife of Arius, was responsible for sculpting the living creatures that inhabit the planes of existence. The first creatures sculpted onto the Ækleosphere were her favorites, the dragons and other scaly creatures. These creatures were left to wander the Ækleosphere, and the gods hoped that they would live in peace. Alas, there was a flaw in the first creatures. They had immense greed for all things precious. Initially Kotar was blamed, as the first signs of greed were for gold and silver, but this changed when the greed expanded to precious stones. Most dragons were content to delve deep into caves and settled with their collected hoards, but some dragons were not so easily satisfied. A great war broke out between the dragons and scaly creatures who occupied the world. The main battles took place on the continent of Nunata, or this land in the common tongues. The last battle was so fierce that it ripped the continent apart and resulted in the floating cliffs that Nunata is known for today. The fair folk were sculpted in response to the dragon wars. Melina sculpted them to try and bring order back to the material plane. The elves were taught many secrets by the gods to arm them for war. This seemed to work, as the elves managed to push back the dragons to the ruined continent of Nunata. As a result for their bravery against the dragons, Arius gave the elves long lives. Over the next several millennia, the elves spread out over the entire material plane, settling on the Lunang, Eaters, and the underground. This resulted in 3 distinct groups of elves: the High Elves, the Forest Elves, and the Deep Elves. The High Elves were the ones that never traveled and remained pure, at least according to them, regarding how Melina had originally sculpted them. The wood elves settled in the forests of the Lonang and took on a more primitive lifestyle compared to the high elves. The deep elves discovered the underground passageways left over from the dragons and built large cities there. The taint of greed found its way into the hearts of some of the elves. The arrogance of the high elves made them the most vulnerable to this taint. They began seeking out darker magic in order to gain more power. They started practicing necromancy and other ways of manipulating flesh. Their experiments led to the introduction of both the undead and the goblin and orc races to enter the Ækleosphere. The elves set out to do their duty and protect the world. The high elves and the forest elves allied together with mercenaries from Nunata. They mistrusted the deep elves due to them looking like the dark elves, and the risk of infiltration was too high. Some high elves even falsely accused the deep elves of bringing dark magic into the world. However, the combined forces of the elves and scaly creatures were not enough to turn the tide. Melina sculpted the stunted folk with the specific intent of making them tough, hardy, and stubborn. The dwarves charging onto the battlefield was a surprise for the dark elves. They were accustomed to the powerful forces of the elves and the resilience of the scaly creatures, but they were not prepared for the combination of those aspects into a single warrior. The dwarves were ferocious on the battlefield, and their unwavering loyalty to the gods allowed them to push back the dark elves and eventually destroy them completely. The creatures made by the dark elves scattered and hid away in the dark, lonely places of the Ækleosphere, biding their time. All that remains of their terrible magics are the few spells inscribed into the stone of the dark elves' towers. But the damage had been done. The material plane was scarred, left in ruin. Ruined elven cities dotted the landscape, and nature eventually overtook them. The gods had learned their lesson with the elves and long life, so they gave the dwarves a shortened lifespan in the hopes that it would prevent any single dwarf from acquiring enough knowledge to threaten the entire Ækleosphere. The dwarves settled on the Lonang, mostly underground, with only a few surface-level cities. They became expert miners and craftsmen. Due to the dwarves not having a natural affinity to magic, they developed intricate mechanisms that allowed them to more effectively mine the materials they required for their crafts. The taint of greed was strong in all living creatures, and eventually took a hold of the dwarven empires. A division broke out between the surface and subterranean dwarven kingdoms. This resulted in a war that neither side would give way due to their stubbornness, and once again the gods had to intervene. The first humans were quiet and timid. They had been granted a severely reduced lifespan, were sculpted much more fragile than the elves, and a lot less hardy and stubborn than the dwarves. But what they did have was ambition. Over time they lost their timidness and grew bold. It would be this boldness and their ambition that propelled them to become the most prevalent race on the material plane. Other races viewed humans akin to a disease because of how fast they spread through the material plane and how quickly they were able to learn knowledge from other races and adapt it to their needs. Humans also had a larger variety of skills that proved beneficial to their spread. The humans on Souk became experts in trading and were quickly referred to as the desert traders. The humans who moved to Ethers and lived among the elves quickly learned the ways of magic and greatly expanded on that. The ones that remained on the Lonang quickly dominated the dwarven kingdoms and became powerful lords. Some even dared to go to Nunata and managed to integrate themselves with the local scaly creatures, but this might only be a legend. The year is 1366 of the Fourth Age. Everyone was going about their business as usual. Farmers on their way to markets to sell their produce. The assassin had caught up to another target and left a body for the city guard to find. Wizards were locked up in their towers, piling over heaps of books. On the other side of the globe, children were asleep. dreaming of magical beings and fantastic tales. Everyone felt it. The material plane trembled. At first people thought it was another earthquake, but over time people began to realize that others around the globe felt it too. This eventually became known as the trembling. In 1368, Nalnira's high heir, an Alvar noble, was tasked to sail to Sauk on a routine trading expedition, but they were caught in a strong, unseasonal storm that sent their ship off course. The storm left them adrift in an unknown area of the moonlit tides. Using the stars and the position of Phaethon, the sun, they were able to determine they were several miles south from the trade routes, but the damage was done and they would have to return home to repair the ship or get another. But they did not have to look for long when they came across land. Not the land they were hoping for, but a volcanic island. As they were approaching the island, it was actively erupting. They named this island Adamor, meaning the mouth of anguish. Upon getting closer to the island, they noticed what they had thought was one large island were in fact several smaller islands. The volcanic was the largest of the islands. The second largest was an island covered in large, sharp rocks. Making landfall there would have been suicide, since it was already overtaken by dragons. They found a large cove on the main island that provided excellent cover from any other storms that might pick up while they were there, and landed in the river mouth. They made several quick repairs to allow them to continue their journey back home in search of a new ship, but Nalnaros had other ideas. Seeing that they were the first people to land on this island, he wanted to claim it for the elves. He sent half of his remaining crew back to where they came from, while he and the rest of the crew would remain on Adamor and start a city aptly named Rivergate. While sailing back west to their lands, the crew on the ship looked back at the new islands and saw a strange green glint on the cliffs just above the waves, and so Glikia got its name. Due to the convenient location of this new group of islands, the Isles of Adamor quickly became a stopping over port for merchants traveling to and from Sauk. The small city of Rivergate grew to become quite a large, and people spread out all over the main islands, Adamor and Glikia. At first the volcano seemed to be a little difficult, having small eruptions every now and then, but nothing to be overly concerned about. Until one fateful day Adamor erupted and would not stop. The city council voted to evacuate Adamor and move everyone to Glikia to get them out of harm's way and wait out the eruption. After a week of constant eruptions, two more eruptions started, one to the northeast and another to the south of Glikia. People were in awe of these eruptions, as they were starkly different to the main eruption, in that they were green. Another week passed, and none of the eruptions gave way. It seemed that Adamor was too dangerous to become a permanent residency for everyone, but the boats that were there weren't enough to get everyone to safety. The slow process of getting everyone to safety began. First the women and children, especially the four who were born on Glikia during the eruptions. The evacuations would take several months to get everyone to safety. During that time, the temporary settlement that they had started became a permanent one, Scorchview. When the evacuation was about halfway, the three eruptions ceased. People were wary at first, and none would believe it. Several brave souls volunteered to stay after the last boat had left to see if the volcanoes had truly stopped. It took another year before anyone dared to set foot on the main island of Adamor again, but they did, and people slowly began returning. Now, 28 years later, in 1397, Adamor is a thriving nation. The volcano has never erupted again. On the contrary, the main part of the two green volcanoes had sunk back into the seas, leaving only small islands in their wake. And this is where the Isles of Adamor begins.